I was watching Slavoj Žižek the other day. I believe I've pronounced his name correctly. And he was presenting an old argument, which has gone on for years, which is about whether or not one needs to engage in psychotherapy to get and explore oneself at depth in order to solve certain problems and know oneself. And his argument is correct. The points he makes are correct, and at the same time, he's incorrect. And I'm gonna illustrate this. So he's correct. If you go in at depth, you will naturally end up in very, very murky waters. And you can continue in those murky waters, trying to get to the bottom of somebody's soul or trying to get to the bottom of your soul. And you're never going to get there because it has infinite depth and infinite variables, and it just goes on and on and on, and it's very complex. At some point, people who come to therapy are trying to solve a problem. That's ultimately what we're trying to do. So that everybody comes in with a problem that they cannot solve. And typically the problem has run them out of energy. It's now disturbing elements of their life. It's disrupting relationships. It's disrupting themselves. So they're trying to solve the problem. So people come in on kind of two routes, and both routes share the same content to a point, although it's individual. But bear with me. Everybody comes into therapy with a presenting problem, or what we call the presenting problem. This is the surface problem, and then underneath that, you'll find what's called the underlying problem. Now, some therapists don't work with the underlying problem. They kind of go, here's the presenting problem. We'll deal with the presenting problem. We'll deal with the anger. We'll deal with the anxiety. We'll deal with the grief and the sadness. And that's that. And sometimes that's enough for people. But that tends to be kind of treating the symptoms, not the cause, papering over things, and it can, again, have its effect. And there's no need to go particularly deep. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Someone comes in with an anger issue, and, that's disruptive. So we deal with the anger issue, or we deal with the anger, and we teach people, this is how you need to calm down, what's going on for you in this moment, etc., etc. But the underlying problem, the presenting problem, comes in as typically it's fear. So fear of being rejected, fear of being betrayed, fear of your world being annihilated somehow, fear of being hurt. And then underneath that, there can be another fear of, how do I manage this? How do I manage this situation? Can I even trust myself? Or there may be some other driver in my world has collapsed before and I don't want that to happen. So it's all fear-based. Now, if you take someone who comes in with grief and loss, again, there's the grief and the sadness, which is the presenting problem, and they're not functioning very well. And then now they've already been wounded. They've already experienced the loss. They've already experienced the rejection, the betrayal, the loss, whatever is going on. So that bit's already done. Now there's this fear creeping in, which is, how do I live my life without this person? How do I live my life without this job, without that house, without my child, whatever it might be? So there's this whole kind of overwhelming change of direction from what a path that you thought you were on to now you're on a new path, and it's completely unknown, and it's fear-inducing. And then there's the overwhelming sadness, and can you express the sadness? Do I hold it back, etc., etc. And again, these can be tackled on the surface, or you could start to go in at depth. Now let's take another route on this. Let's say, and I do work with this. So let's say a client comes in and they've suffered incest earlier on in their life, or some kind of sexual abuse from a family member, maybe typically a stepfather or an uncle or a friend of a friend or something like that. Typically they're women, although sometimes I have men come in the room who've been subjected to this as well. So, and often what I hear is, oh, well, I've seen 3 psychiatrists, 4 psychologists over the last 10 years, and everybody keeps going on about my trauma, and nobody's really done anything, and nobody's really got anywhere. So there's a couple of things going on here. And what can sometimes happen as a therapist is you then become counterintuitive. You start operating counterintuitively. So it's like, okay, so I'm aware of this massive trauma that you have because you've just told me. But what I'm also aware of is that everybody keeps focusing in on this trauma. So the counterintuitiveness, going back to what Zizek was saying, is now I'm going to look at your life current. Because when you're looking at yourself, or when you're working with somebody who's helping you find yourself or look at yourself, what you're trying to do is you use the here and now. So the here and now is a massive indicator of possibly what went on back then and there. What a lot of therapists tend to do, or a lot of healers and doctors and things, is they home in on the trauma and they go, well, this is where all your problems come from. You're like, okay, well, I already know that. It's like I've had, anorexic clients come in and they've kind of gone, everybody just keeps going on about my weight. Yeah, because they're trying to keep you alive, but they're not looking at the underlying problems. They're not looking at the drivers, is it? And it's the same here. So the focus would be for a lot of people on the incest, on the rape that's occurred in your childhood, and how many times it happened, and what was life like, blah 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 blah. If you become counterintuitive and you look at their life and how they conduct their life, you can pretty much soon work out how much that event there has an effect on their lives now, without necessarily going into like the murky depths of something as extreme as incest or childhood sexual abuse. And so in that respect, Žižek's making a very good point. And a lot of people just home in on it and go, well, I need to look here. And it's like, no, you still need to go with the presenting problem that the client came in with and their current life and how they operate within their current world, because that gives you a lot of clues as to what possibly what influence the past had. And it also can give you a whole lot of clues as to what possibly happened in the past without the client even saying it. And then you can go pre-trauma. So you can find out what early childhood was like. So if you know that the trauma happened like as an adolescent, or maybe as a young child, say 7 or 8 years old, well, have a dig before that. And that's where depth comes in. But that's also where the skill as a therapist, or the skill as whoever's helping, comes in, as to know where to, or have a very good intuition about where to navigate to within a person's life. Or if you're looking at your own stuff, where to navigate to. And the first place to look is the present. Next place to look is to start to look in the past. And then you choose how deep to go with it. And it's like using what is necessary. So let's go back to an angry client that I had come in the room. This is a real situation, a real case. So angry client comes in the room. Presenting problem was, I'm intimidating, I'm angry, I'm always angry at people, and I get angry about this, and I get angry about that, da 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 da. And then I asked the question, are you on any medication? And they told me they'd been on Xanax for like 30 years. Now I'm thinking in my head, hang on, Xanax is for anxiety. So this person's anxious. So I asked the question, what were you medicated for? What was the prognosis? What was the diagnosis? And they're like, I'm anxious. And I'm like, anxious and anger. Presenting problem, underlying problem. The underlying problem is the anxiety. The presenting problem is the anger. The anger is protecting the self from the anxiety. Protecting the self from the world, which is anxiety inducing, is my first guess. But let's explore further. So you start asking questions, and you can do this for yourself as well. So you start asking questions, and then you go further back in time, and you do have to dig around in the past. And then we found out that as a child, his parents were violent, played mind games with him, sabotaged certain plans he had, itchy leg, sabotaged certain plans he had. So it's like, okay, this is interesting. And then we got into all of this blame. So, I used a technique with this particular client I'm thinking of. We used the empty chair. We got 9-year-old self in the chair. 9-year-old self started talking. He started interacting. Okay, it's all psychodrama and imaginary, but it's a projection from inside here. And then we got to self-blame, shame, guilt. And then it's not your fault. Tell him it's not your fault. And then it's like, the guy's sitting there and he's like, it's not my fault. And it's like, no, it's not your fault. Then he tried to justify his upbringing through, well, that's 1970s parenting. And we got into all of that. And it's like, no, that's not a justification for the way you were treated. And that's also not a justification for you taking on the blame for your parents' behavior towards you as a child. Because there are plenty of children who were raised in the 1970s who had very loving, empathic, and nurturing parents, as well as that old school, tough love, violent upbringing that a lot of people have, which people still suffer with today. And then we got into all of these techniques that he could do to help himself in the current moments when he's feeling anxious, and wean himself off Xanax, and certain journaling techniques or psychodrama techniques. He could speak to himself, reparenting, if you like, the self. We did all of those exercises. But the point I'm trying to make here is there's a presenting problem. There was a medical solution, which was the Xanax. The medical solution was on it. It was on the underlying problem. The underlying problem is the anxiety, but anxiety comes from fear. Where does that come from? He learned it in childhood because his childhood was frankly shit and violent. That's the whole problem. Whereas a lot of people will go, and if you kind of roll with what Zizek says, then you would just go with the presenting problem, which is the anger. This is where I believe he's incorrect. Now, knowing where to stop in the murky depths, knowing when you've gone deep enough is the skill of the practitioner. And that comes from experience of making a whole load of mistakes and a whole load of also a whole load of good stuff that you did as a therapist, and learning your client, not trying to fit your client to your agenda or your theories or your theoretical framework, whatever. It's actually rolling with, then we get back to going with the client, ebbing and flowing with the person, their pace, their processing, and what they need, not what you think they need. And this takes a very open mind, and a lot of keeping your ego in check as a therapist. But anyway, that's another whole side point. And it's the same with if you get somebody extreme, let's say you've suffered incest or sexual abuse, people get fed up going round and round in their trauma. Oh, that's my trauma. Oh, that's my trauma. Let's talk about my trauma a little bit more. Let's talk about all the bad shit that happened. And it's like, in that respect, Zizek's right. That's not going to tell you about yourself. That's going to tell you more about what happened to you. And it's probably going to re-traumatize you a lot. And it's going to keep the whole thing alive. But that doesn't mean you should avoid it. And I'm going to repeat myself here. You go back to the presenting problem. You go back to how you operate in your world currently, because that gives you all the clues as to what you are trying to solve back then and there, how you've managed your way through it. And then you can learn from that, like we did with the empty chair technique with the angry guy who's actually anxious. Then you can start letting go of certain things. Because what children do, what we all tend to do, is if we get told it enough from the environment, we start to introject it. And what I mean by introjection is we start to believe it. That, and then it's like an inception thing. It's like we actually then believe this was our idea and we created it. This conclusion we've come to, that it's our fault, or that we should feel shameful, or that we exist and that's a problem. That is often something that's given to you, which I'm going to approach in a different video, not this one, because otherwise this will go on forever. And just as a last thing, if you are going in at depth and you are exploring the murky depths of your soul, you will only be able to go so far with someone, as far as, if you're a therapist, as far as you've gone with yourself. If you haven't gone to your murky depths, you're not going to be able to help anybody else going to get there, because you're going to find it quite intimidating. So the conclusion to all of this is you don't always necessarily need to go in at depth. If you do go in at depth, you need enough skill and enough to listen to your intuition, enough to kind of say, okay, enough's enough. We don't need to go any deeper. We've found the answers we needed to find, and we can now work with something to help myself or help the person I'm trying to help move forward in their life and release themselves from some of the shackles that have been holding them back, which were created and wrapped around them in the past. This is important. And if you make mistakes as a therapist, or if you're exploring yourself and you make mistakes, they don't always need to be big mistakes. Sometimes it's just that you missed something. You missed a clue. You didn't see this. You didn't ask yourself that question, or you didn't ask your client that question. So that is where learning comes from. Mistakes create learning. And they can also create reparation, because if you make a big mistake, sometimes it's the best thing you can do for someone is to repair that damage, is to repair that mistake, because a lot of people have never experienced it. So if you want to go deep, go deep. Prepare for murky depths. If you want to stay on the surface, great, stay on the surface. But just look for the underlying problem, the driver behind the presenting problem.